Well, hello everybody. My name is Alexa. I'm the English intern at UNAM, Canada, and this is another session of Chatting with Canadians. This is Etienne. He's our guest speaker. He's a radio host at a radio community station, and the topic for today is Canadian music and identity. In this interview, we are going to explore the origins, the characteristics of Canadian music, and how it is related to Canadians' cultural identity. So my first question is, what are the origins of Canadian music?
Okay, so your viewers probably know that Canada is a very, very large country, but culturally speaking, it's much younger than Mexico. Mexican culture is much older than ours, and our culture is also very much an immigrant culture, although some people would not call it that necessarily. But what we have to know is that there are three big cultural groups that which we could call the founding members of Canadian music, which are First Nation people, the French people, and the English people. And because this interview doesn't last 3 hours, I'm going to concentrate a little more on the English. And the other thing also, because we're such a large country, for a very, very long time, these groups were more or less self-contained. There was some input from outside, but because the distances, I mean, if any of the people that are listening have ever been to Canada, that they know that the distance between one town and another is very, very long. So you can imagine, before the train, before cars, your world was your village. So if there was an outside influence, it was because of somebody on a trip came by through your city, and you would hear something. So when it comes to English culture, in terms of the music, it's more or less 300 to 400 years old. And it's due to different waves of immigration that came to Canada. So the first few waves were British, Scottish, and Irish. They're more or less related to commerce and military. So a great deal of our music for about 250 years, more or less, was either religious, military, or work-related. And what I mean work-related is, I'm not sure if you have this in the Mexican culture. We had a lot of manual work. Canada was a resource economy, which means a lot of cutting down trees, exploiting resources. These are all works that require a certain rhythm, especially if you work in teams. So work songs usually actually have a very precise rhythm. So if, for example, if you're cutting a tree and there's two men doing it, it was usually a man's job because it was very distant and very dangerous. And also for religious and cultural purposes. And so the best way for them to know when to pull and push the saw was the rhythm of the song. So that was one aspect of it. The other, of course, is religious music. So although there are a lot of Catholics amongst the Irish, there was in the Church of England a lot of hymns that are sung. So that's another part of the music. And so that was more or less the world of music in Canada until more or less the 20th century. And our music got to be very different in the 20th century because in the late 19th, early 20th century, a lot of people came to Canada that were not of those cultural groups. So we have a lot of Chinese immigrants in the West, so mostly British Columbia. They're helping to build the trains, and the train tracks mostly. And so we have Chinese opera getting into Canada. We have a lot of people from Italy, which I think South America got a lot more in Argentina. So they were more into construction. And we have different groups that come to Canada and they bring new music. And the thing that changes also is things like records, radio, and television. So that's the 20th century. And that brings in a completely different world, because now you can be in the deep, deep country or up north, and you can hear this music that you had to go to the big cities to hear. So jazz comes in, and what we have to say about Canadians is that they are very good at assimilating outside music and making it their own. So there's not so much new Canadian genres as they are influences. So, and that continues to this day with streaming services, I think.
Okay, good. And what genres that are less known in the world are originally from Canada? Because you were mentioning the influence from other cultures, but which genres are originally from Canada?
I've been trying to research this for a while. There is a lot of debate as to even what is Canadian music amongst artists. And so outside of the First Nation music, which is not as well known as it should in Canada, although that's starting to change, there is not so much a genre that was born here. What I would say happens quite a lot, and I've observed that in Japanese culture as well, although they, not so much for their music, but for other things, is that we take what we get from the outside and we make it our own. So for example, Drake is a good example. So Drake is from Toronto. He's well known throughout the world. He hasn't invented anything, but he's taken hip hop and he has made it his own. It doesn't sound anything like what the Americans are doing, and it doesn't sound like what the British are doing. It's still hip hop. It's still in English, but it is a sound all its own. And there are other hip hop artists, and there are folk musicians that have made these genres slightly different. They made it their own, but they didn't really create something. And we have a lot of debate in Canada as to what is Canadian music, and that's very complicated.
Yeah. I understand. Okay, and for example, you were mentioning Drake. He's a really popular Canadian singer that many people know about. But which less known Canadian singers or songwriters would you like our audience to know more about?
Okay, so that question, I think we should separate in two. So there are the unknown Canadian artists, maybe outside of Canada, and there are well-known artists that not everybody knows are Canadian, which can be an interesting topic all of its own. If we go through different periods, I would recommend, if you have people that are listening that are into folk music from the 60s, there was a group called Ian and Sylvia, which was very interesting. For people that have more of an American musical background, I'd say they're like our Peter, Paul, and Mary. So they're very melodic. Their texts are very anti-war, pro-peace. So there's that. There's Buffy St. Marie, which is very interesting. So she is a First Nation artist. The Tragically Hip were founded in the 80s. I'd say they're alternative rock, which I think is the best way to describe them. And they tried to have some popular success in the States, but they were said to be too Canadian. So because the references are very Canadian, they talk about little towns in Canada and things that are extraordinarily local, but at the same time, it's very universal. I'm from Ottawa, so there's another name that comes to mind, which is Bruce Cockburn, which is not written that way, and I won't say how it's written because, frankly, it sounds very dirty when you say it out loud. But he is also a man who's very much into very complex songs, not so much in terms of music. The music it's relatively easy on the ears, but the texts are very deep, very poetic. And there's also Gordon Lightfoot, which is, I think he's in his 80s now. He's still touring Canada, and his songs are considered amongst the very, very Canadian founding music, because there are stories that happen in little towns long ago. So it feels a little like our folk singers and our folk legends incarnated in one man. And there's another name that comes to mind, which is Calixia Lavallée, which most Canadians actually don't know, but he's the one who actually wrote our national anthem. But that's going back a few hundred, like at least 100 years, if not more. Now, for Canadian artists that are really well known, but not necessarily as Canadians, we have Leonard Cohen, which is unfortunately just passed away, but it was amazing. Paul Anka, which again from Ottawa, more the grandparents' generation, I'm guessing, amongst.
Yes.
There's Alanis Morissette, the Bare Naked Ladies. So if you have fans of The Big Bang Theory, the theme music, that's the Bare Naked Ladies. They've done much more than the theme music of The Big Bang Theory, but that's what they're best known for. Sarah McLachlan, although that goes back a little while, Alanis Morissette, and one of the songs that most Americans really like, but that's a Canadian, is a song by the Guess Who, which is a group from the 60s. So American Woman, which most Americans think is a really nice song about their culture, is actually a Canadian song, and it's very critical. So if people actually bother to read the words, it's not actually the most positive thing you've ever read about America. There's Shania Twain in country. She's from Ontario. And Nelly Furtado, which, I mean, she's been at it now for almost 20 years. But I think she's more representative of where Canadian music is going. So she's of Portuguese descent. So she's actually taken parts of her culture, the musical part and also the poetic part, and she's integrated into her music, but she made it very easy for people to like and to hear. Not so much on her dance albums, but she's actually put out a folk album. I think it was her second or third album quite a few years ago. So these are interesting Canadian artists to look at.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now, which type of music do Canadians prefer?
Okay, so again, not an easy answer.
Yeah, I know. But generally speaking.
Yes. So unlike Mexico, I'd say I find that Mexico has a much more balanced musical culture in that let's say somebody becomes very big in the north, people in the south will hear about them. I think there's more communication. Whereas Canada, it depends a lot on your age and where you live. For example, country music is very big out west, not so much in Quebec, although it's starting, but it's French country music, so it doesn't necessarily communicate. I'd say rock for a long time was a very unifying genre of music. Also folk, but that's more in the 60s and 70s. So I'd say today it's more, I'd say every Canadian knows Nickelback, for example. So the big names I mentioned earlier that are known throughout the world are usually what Canadians listen to. So I'd say Canadians know about their musical culture, but sometimes it takes people from outside to teach them about their own musical geniuses. We're not always appreciative of what we have at home.
Okay, well, I understand that Canadian music is influenced by other cultures, but what makes Canadian music different from others?
So I think in this regard, it's an openness to outside influences, but I'd say Canadian music is not so much different from others. It's just very good at creating a music that doesn't necessarily sound Canadian. We're very good chameleons, let's put it that way. I think the fact that it's not really centralized, we don't have a New York or a Los Angeles that produces music that radiates. We have Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, which are cultural hubs, but they don't necessarily dictate what the musical culture is going to be. But the big studios are there. But I think we have a lot of little microcosms throughout the country, which allows us to have different sounds.
Okay, and now talking about identity, how would you say Canadian music relates to Canadians' cultural identity?
So one thing we have to say about Canadians is that we like our governments, and we like our governments to be very involved. That's not true, again, 100% of all Canadians, but a lot of our identity is fused to our political history. So whereas we were very isolated for a long time, like we mentioned a little earlier, ever since 1967, we have had a very big government involvement in musical culture. The reason is 1967 is the 100th year of our founding as the modern Canadian landscape that people know. So 100 years ago, 100 years from 1967, so 1867, we had these enormous celebrations in 1967, and the government decided, well, this is a good time to really establish what Canadian identity is. Until then, it was basically very Americanized. So what you have to know about Canada is most of us live very close to the Americans. So when you look at a map of Canada, there's a lot of empty space. So people are down here and most of that is empty. So for a long time, especially in radio and television, what we got were American shows and American music. So for a long time, that made a lot of people nervous because they thought we would lose our Canadian identity. And so the government started putting different programs in place to help Canadian musicians. We have something called Canadian content laws here in Canada. They're called CanCon, but they used to be called Maple, which is very, very complex system. But it basically means that if you're a radio station or a television station, you have to play X number of Canadian songs every day for a certain amount of time. And that was actually very controversial when it came out. A lot of radio stations were really mad because they said, well, we can't play the Beatles anymore. We'll have to play Anne Murray ad nauseum, which if any of your viewers have ever heard, she has a really beautiful voice, but they're very repetitive songs. And not a lot of people are big fans nowadays, but it was proven to be a paranoid reaction because there was a lot of Canadian music out there that just wasn't getting played. And so a lot of artists actually were able to be discovered this way. To this day, it's still, though, very controversial because now with the internet, we don't have those laws concerning the internet. We only have them for television and radio. So the government is still is still working to try to get Canadian music out there and get it protected. We also have a ministry called the Heritage Ministry of Canada, and they finance the disc labels. So still to this day, we do put out quite a lot of physical discs. And part of the cost of that is actually paid by the government. So the people of Canada, even if they don't necessarily buy their music, are paying for their music. So, so a great deal of our musical identity is actually linked to our government. But the government doesn't necessarily choose who gets it. So it's not for the, let's say it's not Justin Trudeau that says to the record labels, oh, I like Nickelback, I want a new album. It's not that direct, but the government still has a certain role into it. And I think it's also because, again, because Canadians are so open to all these outside sources, there's always a fear of whatever is unique here might just get flooded. So it's always this very intricate dance that goes on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Etienne. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you everybody for watching.